From the outside looking in, the Chinese economy looks like it's going absolutely gangbusters. You look at the nature of new products coming out of China, whether it be dancing humanoid robots or flying cars. It looks like the future has arrived and it's being exported by China. But on the inside, it doesn't quite feel the same way. Long-term optimism, that's not there anymore. I think the Chinese Communist Party would be far more reluctant to pursue that sort of headlong drive by private institutions to come up with the God AI. The Communist Party's always had a few reservations about God to start with.
Welcome to the Brad Carr Podcast. My guest is Dinny McMahon, a financial journalist, formerly of the Wall Street Journal, now with TriviumChina, and the author of China's Great Wall of Debt, Shadow Banks, Ghost Cities, Massive Loans, and the End of the Chinese Miracle. Dinny McMahon, you've said that there's been a change in the mood in China. What is that mood on the ground in China?
So when we're talking about the economy, what I would have said is that certainly in the years that I was living there and sort of my time covering China, there's always been a sense that when the economy weakens or slacks off in some ways, there's a sense in the public that the government will do something to set it right. And I remember there being a downturn in 2015. Infrastructure wasn't as strong. There was a bit of a slump in the property market. And you talk to business people and they'd be like, well, look, things aren't great, but it'll be okay. Things are going to turn around. And this time, things are a little bit different. Now, I would have said a few years ago, sort of coming off the back of the pandemic, China didn't have the sort of the resurgence in consumption that everybody was assuming would happen once the lockdowns finished. And there was a sense at the time that things are different this time. This is a bit more of a prolonged downturn. But give it a couple of years, things will come back. And I think even that sort of limited optimism has really sort of eroded over the last year, over the last 18 months. And so the sense that that the sort of default setting that used to be in place, which was like, don't worry about it, the government will fix things. Sure, things might not be great now, but we've seen this, we've read this script before, we know how things end. There's a real sense that they're operating from a different script. And I think ordinary Chinese families and households are struggling and suffering in a way that we really haven't seen over the past 20 years. Because putting aside the fact that there was always this sense that the government will intervene and things will be made right, there was this sort of experience that I guess at least one, maybe two generations of Chinese people have had of the rising tide lifting all boats, the sense that next year will be better than this year, that the experience and the outlook of my children will be better than my own. And you kind of had generations of Chinese people kind of making sacrifices, moving away from their families, working long hours in tough conditions in factories and industrial plant, for low wages, all in the sense that things are getting better and things are going to be better tomorrow than they were today. And I think there is a sense, certainly a feeling in the developed world, in places like the United States and Europe, there's a sense that people's children are not going to be as well off as they are. And there is certainly an element of that in China as well. Since the collapse of the property market in 2021, you've seen a lot of local governments cut wages, some state-owned firms cut wages, withhold people's social security contributions and things like that. You travel to China, almost everybody has a story about a family member or a friend having suffered some sort of wage cut. And I think there is a real uncertainty about what the economic future holds. So that old sense of, things can only get better, onwards and upwards, the future is bright. There's a lot more ambiguity, and people don't have the same sort of confidence about that sort of bright future as they once did. So when I was writing about a change in mood, I think those are the two kind of aspects. One, that sort of, unadulterated long-term optimism that I think has really been in place in China for the last 30, maybe even 40 years. That's not there anymore. And the other thing is that sort of, that sort of faith in the government's capacity to turn things around has been hugely eroded over the last few years as well. And I think that started with the pandemic. The lockdowns were far more draconian than anybody were expecting. And then all of a sudden, Beijing turned on a dime when it decided it wasn't working. Again, completely unexpected. And then everyone kind of came out the other end, and the domestic economy hasn't sort of recovered or sort of regained the sort of pre-pandemic vitality that everyone had kind of got used to. And so I think really that's how the mood has shifted, and that's in some ways kind of the experience of living in China's economy has changed over the last few years.
And Denny, this shaken confidence or faith in the government in a communist country, how does that play into the economic well-being of the country? How important is it that people have that faith?
I know that's always kind of that residual. When are the Chinese people going to lose faith and turn on the Chinese Communist Party? I think we're probably a long way from that particular moment happening, but it sort of manifests in other sorts of ways. I mean, traditionally, people in China have kind of always hedged against the sort of, hedged against political instability and, political changes and whatnot by, trying to get a portion of their savings overseas, sending their kids overseas to study, so that they potentially, someone in the family has a visa or a passport that will allow them to move. So you've kind of traditionally had that sort of hedging behaviour. At the moment, I don't think it's necessarily that sort of shift in that mood has necessarily changed people's behaviour. In terms of that sort of political sense, but we are seeing it in the way people are consuming and the way people are spending. As I sort of alluded to before, coming off the back of the pandemic, there was a huge amount written in the Chinese press about what people expected to be revenge spending. I mean, for about a year, people had kind of been locked up in their apartments in Chinese cities in these sort of revolving lockdowns, which were far more draconian than anywhere else in the world. And there was a sense of like, okay, well, people have been locked up at home. They've been earning but not spending. As soon as they're let out of their homes, they're going to spend. They're going to spend on experiences. They're going to just be out and enjoying life. Buying the things that they sort of, put off buying, and none of it materialized. And at first it was like, I know the central bank was like, well, of course you can't expect that to materialize immediately. There's going to be a bit of a lag as people sort of, get used to that, they rebuild their confidence, but it's coming. And ultimately it never came. And so and meanwhile, the savings of Chinese households, what were originally branded as emergency savings, because people were saving more because of the uncertainty of their environment, they just keep going up and up. And you look at the data from the first quarter of this year, of 2026, I mean, Chinese savings rates are at an all-time high almost. I mean, we're in kind of a strange situation where people are still saving more and more, and their propensity to spend, to consume is really quite weak. And so I think that kind of feeds into this sort of shift in mood. There is a real lack of confidence among Chinese households in the moment in the state of the Chinese economy, which I know is kind of incredible for foreign observers to think, because you're looking at from the outside looking in, the Chinese economy looks like it's going absolutely gangbusters. I mean, you look at the nature of new products coming out of China, whether it be, dancing humanoid robots or flying cars and, electric vehicles, which are, incredibly well designed. It looks like the future has arrived and it's being exported by China. That's what it looks like from the outside looking in. But on the inside, it doesn't quite feel the same way. And so, and that's turning up in the way people are spending and saving.
Mm. Well, we'll have to talk more about that futuristic element in AI and all of that. But Denny, you mentioned twice now the pandemic. I would wonder, just in general, what is your postmortem on the pandemic in China and how it's affected China?
It's to be honest, I haven't really thought about it for a while. I think my sense is that everyone had all these sort of expectations of what China's economy would look like when we came out of the pandemic, and it didn't materialize that way. And it's not just because of the pandemic. And I think there was kind of an inclination at the time to kind of see everything through that lens, that, oh, people aren't spending because, I don't know, they're traumatized. People are going to spend because of, they want to get their lives back. But other stuff happened during those pandemic years as well, which kind of were difficult to kind of clock the impact on Chinese society and the economy at the time, because the pandemic and the lockdowns just kind of had such this overweening, overarching impact. And one of those things was the peaking of China's housing market. I mean, Chinese, property sales peaked in 2021. I think it's fair to say now that it was a bubble. I mean, the sheer degree to which the housing market has sort of collapsed in terms of annual investment in new housing, prices. I think prices are down 30, 35, 40% from their peak. I mean, it's difficult to track because in some ways China isn't one single housing market. It's a multiple markets based on, like, if you're in the most developed cities, the middle tier, the poorer cities. But, you had a massive decline over the last 5 years in housing prices, and the amount of new housing being built each year, the amount of investment going into building new housing, is now at the same level as 2013. So you kind of had this, this all throughout the 2010s where investments and purchases just went up and up and up. We're now at a point where annual investment is back at a level almost before that really started running away. So I think it's fair to say that, in the final years of the 2010s, we were kind of looking at a bit of a bubble. And so that has had all sorts of implications for China's economy and even for ordinary Chinese households. I mean, pretty much for anybody who had bought a home in the 2010s, I think pretty much, particularly since 2015, I mean, the value of your home would be underwater. Any sort of gains, capital gains that you experienced from buying your house. Sure, the price went up until 2021, but chances are very good that if you tried to sell your home now, it would be for a price less than what you paid for it. And of course, that has a huge impact on people's confidence, on their own sense of wealth. And that's kind of just lingering there, it's sort of having this sort of silent impact on the economy, because people aren't willing to spend because this key source of people's wealth, the place where people put most of their savings, where they spent years of their life saving to be able to buy a home in the expectation that once I had it, like it was fair to assume that the value of that asset would more than double over a decade. I mean, that's being conservative. Housing prices in China only ever went one direction. And so it made sense to put your life savings in there. And yet now it's gone completely completely the opposite direction. And there doesn't really seem to be any end in sight. I mean, no one has any sense of when property prices are going to start heading in the other direction. And when they do, it's likely to start in a very small handful of cities like Beijing and Shanghai and Shenzhen. And then it'll be years later where smaller cities around the country finally start seeing that growth as well, assuming that it ever happens. So that's one of the other things that happened during the pandemic years. So it's not the pandemic, but this was a major shift in the Chinese economy that kind of happened during the pandemic years. And then one of the other things that I'm less sure about, but I think there's enough anecdotal evidence to suggest probably happened during the pandemic years as well, was that China's declining demographic profile potentially started to have an impact on consumption during the pandemic years. Now, what I mean about that is it's pretty well known that China's population peaked in 2021 and it is shrinking. The number of, the size of the Chinese population is going to keep declining until the end of the century. And I think it was the UN put together a bunch of estimates based on certain assumptions about whether the fertility rate would increase, decline, stay stable. And its sort of median estimate, I think, was we're kind of looking at a decline in the Chinese population of 600, 700 million people by the end of the century. So the decline, the population decline is pretty well known. But the other thing that is happening isn't just that there's going to be fewer Chinese people, but that the balance between working age people and retirees is being increasingly weighted towards retirees. Now, of course, this is a phenomenon that's affecting so many countries around the world. I mean, certainly Europe, Japan already, South Korea, Thailand. It's going to be a huge problem. But the pace at which that's happening in China is really quite rapid. And it's kind of difficult to sort of tell, at what ultimately the problem with that is that retirees generally speaking, spend less than people who have jobs. And as there's going to be more retirees, the amount of domestic consumption, people spending money on stuff is just going to decline. So the challenge for economists is trying to work out to what extent that's already having an impact or when that's likely to have an impact. And there's been some work by demographers in China suggesting it's already having an impact, but in a way that you wouldn't necessarily think. And they think that the impact is sort of showing up in the spending habits of people in their 40s and 50s. So these are people who still have jobs, all right? But they are really the first generation of the one-child policy. Certainly, people in their 40s, not so much their 50s. So these are people who, married couples, probably with one kid, who between the two of them are supporting 4 retirees. And those 4 retirees are probably either already about over 65 or maybe 70 or in their early 70s. And so their medical bills are going up. Now, so the way that it's impacting consumption is that these sorts of families are saving a lot more aggressively, partly because the pension system is inadequate, and so they're going to need to put aside more money to support their parents. And secondly, the medical system is inadequate. And if you have a medical emergency in China, it can be completely financially debilitating to a family. And so people are putting aside, at a time where people at sort of their peak earning capacity and even their peak spending capacity, say in their 40s, are saving far more aggressively because of the responsibilities forced upon them by this sort of demographic challenge that China is facing. Now, of course, it's really difficult to come up with data on this, but what we found during the pandemic is province after province. It actually started before the pandemic. I think the first instance of this happening was 2018, where a province started giving only children of that without any brothers and sisters, giving them additional vacation days of I think between 10 and 15 a year to be explicitly used to take care of their parents. And I think it may have been Hebei was the first province to do it, and then there were a few more in I think 2029, more in 2020, more in 2021, and of course to one level you could put this down to the pandemic. But as I said, this started before the pandemic, and I think it was a reflection that we're now at a point where the medical needs of parents of only children are now such that the burden of taking care of them is becoming a real societal problem, and potentially that's now starting to feed through into people's consumption habits. So really long-winded answer about the pandemic question, because I think the real way that we're going to look back on the pandemic years in China when we come at it from an economic lens is not just trying to get a sense of the impact of the pandemic on the economy, but the impact of all this other stuff that's harder to quantify that was happening during the pandemic or was worsening during the pandemic that then had an impact on the economy and has continued to linger in unexpected ways since then.
Wow. So it sounds like then maybe the pandemic was an accelerant on some things that were just beginning before that happened, and then we're seeing it sort of in its fuller effect now.
Yeah, I think that during the pandemic years, sort of the children of the only children of two parents, those parents were kind of getting to an age where their medical bills were rising, and of course the sort of the pandemic just sort of accelerated the medical risks of sort of people in that sort of situation, which was why we perhaps saw an acceleration of people getting more leave, being given more leave by provincial governments, and certainly since then those forces have probably got worse because the number of retirees or elderly with only one child has only just got higher and higher and will continue to get more and more over the next decade. So yeah, it's a phenomenon that I think started to emerge immediately before the pandemic and has just sort of accelerated ever since.
Mm-hmm. And then this factor that's showing up that you're seeing is that people in their peak spending years, say 40s, are saving to make sure they have money to take care of their aging parents because they were the one child who needs to take care of two parents, and their spouse was probably one child who needs to take care of two parents. So there's this squeeze on everybody financially, and at the same time, there's this declining faith in the government and a sense that things like Social Security may not even come through, that the medical expenses could be tremendous. Is that sort of the picture?
Yeah, actually, Brad, you put that far more articulately than I did. That's exactly what's going on. And it's not so much that they're worried that you're right. They're worried that the social security benefits aren't going to come through. And one of the reasons for that is that it's well known that China's pension system is inadequately funded. That I forget who did the review, but it was a government agency did a review that under the current funding regime, the main pension fund was due to run out of money in 2035. And so, they've kind of changed the rules under, who can retire at what age. But ultimately, I think they've only bought themselves a couple of extra years. And so people in China know that the pension fund isn't adequately funded. And even then, if you are getting a pension, it's not necessarily going to be anywhere near enough to sort of maintain a level of lifestyle comparable to what you're sort of used to. And there's a huge divergence between what you're going to get out of that pension if you live in a city or you live in the countryside, or if you work for a state-owned firm, or you work, if you're a contract worker or informal migrant worker. I mean, the sheer divergence in what you can expect from the state based on where you live and just based on your previous employment status is huge. And so that means very, very different things for different families that are going to have to step in to a different degree to help their parents. But it's very well known in China that the pension system isn't adequately funded. I think there's a sense of, the government's going to have to do something. They'll work out some sort of solution. But this has been a conversation for a long time now, and we really haven't seen anything that's going to meaningfully move the needle in terms of properly funding the shortfall. So it's difficult to really have a sense of how they're going to, sort of get themselves out of this bind. When it comes to medical spending, the Chinese state has been incrementally spending more and more on healthcare over the past decade. They speak of it as being a priority. Certainly, out-of-pocket expenses have been declining, but at the end of the day, out-of-pocket expenses for the elderly are significantly higher. The state is spending more on it, but then at the same time, their needs are higher, and so anyone with an elderly parent kind of knows that potentially the costs are debilitating. And so the government is also doing things like it's setting up programs for hospice care that are partially funded by the state. I mean, they recognize the problems and they're trying to spend more on it. But I haven't seen anything so far that is going to meaningfully change the economic considerations of families that are going to have to make up the shortfall.
So, Denny, knowing all this, then how is there the perception, at least that I sense in the U.S., that China is just growing, just on this tear economically, that they're always sort of right on the heels of the U.S. as being the world's largest economy?
Yeah, it's I think we have that sense because of China's absolutely incredible export machine, and a very deliberate decision by Beijing about how it's kind of going to grow out of its problems. For years, economists have been saying that, at some point after China's housing market collapses, then we're going to see a change in China's economic model towards consumption. Because, that's what you've got to keep in mind. The thing that really drove China's economy over the last 20 years, up until 2021, what drove it for about 20 years was investment in housing and, to a lesser extent, infrastructure. And for most of that period, that was completely legitimate because there was this real lack of quality housing in the places that people needed it. Initially in the cities, people living in the cities, the sort of housing conditions they were living under were really substandard. And then, over time, you had this massive migration of people from the countryside into the cities. And so that required even more housing. And on top of that, you required infrastructure for the cities and infrastructure to support sort of the, expanding economy. And so all this sort of stuff managed to drive economic growth for years and years and years. And of course, then we kind of got to a point where there was overinvestment, and we see this now with all the empty housing that developers haven't been able to sell. You see it in underutilized airports. You see it in bridges to nowhere, all that sort of stuff. And so there was always a sense that when the housing bubble popped, China would have to pivot to a consumption-led economy where the thing that would lead economic growth was just ordinary people buying stuff, which is really how the US economy works. It's how most developed economies work. And so that would result in lower levels of growth, but it'd be sustainable, it'd be more stable, and that was sort of, in some quarters, that was assumed that's what was going to happen. But ultimately, Beijing decided to take another approach for various reasons. But their approach was like, look, we don't want to do that because ultimately that would require wealth redistribution. And so it means giving more money to households, because how are you going to boost consumption? Well, you've got to put more money into people's pockets. And so that would require some sort of state-led redistribution campaign. Now, they're all in favor of eventually having households spend more, but they don't want to do it through government redistribution, which really, that's code for welfare, right? They don't want to do it through welfare programs. What they want to do is they want to generate a sustainable economic growth model that can eventually result in higher consumption because it raises people's incomes. They want to do it by raising productivity. And, productivity is this kind of economic concept, but ultimately, to sort of boil it down, it's about being able to do things more efficiently, or it's about creating new technologies that ultimately you're able to produce in a way that generates greater economic value. And so that has been the razor focus of Xi Jinping's, the economic transformation that Xi Jinping has in mind. That effort to raise productivity has broken down, if you're kind of breaking it down to its most basic concepts, they're trying to raise productivity in two ways. On one hand, there's been this headlong drive into innovation. So it's all about generating new innovative products. It's about foundational science, research and development. It's effectively coming up with new things that China develops the proprietary technology themselves, commercializes them, creates new products, and sells them into the market. And we're seeing this most clearly with electric vehicles, and storage batteries. The founding technology wasn't developed by the Chinese, but what they've managed to do is come up with incremental innovations and been able to mass commercialize it. And now we're seeing the fruits of that. The other side of the equation, so you've got, in this productivity drive, on one end, you've got this innovation drive, and on the other end is this effort towards industrial upgrading. And so the idea is, I mean, when I was in university back in the 90s, we were sort of taught this model of economic development called the flying geese, whereby, developing countries, would start off manufacturing relatively low-end goods, whether it be, sneakers or toys or some basic electronics. And then they would, as wages went up, they would graduate into more sophisticated manufactured goods. And the lower-end stuff, well, they'd migrate somewhere else. Right, because labor, cost of labor had got too expensive. Those goods, toys, sneakers, they'd have to be manufactured somewhere else where the labor was even cheaper. And so the idea was you had this flying geese formation, and in East Asia, the leading goose was Japan, and then behind that it was South Korea and I guess Taiwan, then behind that Malaysia and Thailand. It's sort of this cascading effect of manufacturing. Japan was producing the highest end, highest technological content manufactured goods, and then behind them, South Korea, and until you got to, say, Vietnam, which was sort of the lowest, which was kind of starting off, and with it was China. And so the idea was, people looked at China and assumed that at some point labor in China would get too expensive and the low-end manufactured goods that China was making would migrate somewhere else. And we've seen a certain amount of that, of low-end manufacturing going to Vietnam, going to Bangladesh and some other places. But over the last few years, China's leaders have been very explicit about their intent to be able to keep as many of those low-end industries as possible. And and the way that they are doing that is by replacing labor with machines. And so there's this great example of the cigarette lighter industry, which sort of bounced around the world since I think the 1950s and the 1960s, or even earlier. I mean, it started off in France and Germany, early 20th century, migrated to Japan, then to Korea, and then it ended up, I think, in Guangdong and Zhejiang provinces in China, and then it migrated to a place called Shandong in Hunan province. And this place makes 90% of the world's cigarette lighters. And then I think it was in about 2010, it was having the same problem that any place on earth has when it's manufacturing low-end goods. Wages were going up. And so it was becoming increasingly difficult to find people who were willing to work. They still needed to make cigarette lighters at very, very low prices because that's what their clients were demanding, but they couldn't find the labor at the necessary prices. And so there were two options. The industry could either move somewhere else, or they could start upgrading their industrial plant. And so I think since 2010, the industry as a whole in that town has gone through, I think, 6 rounds of industrial upgrading. I think the size of the workforce has declined, 85% over those years, and the cost of making a cigarette lighter has gone down 95%. And that is in some ways kind of representative or indicative of what Beijing wants to achieve across all low-end manufacturing industries. It wants to keep those industries in China, but it wants to replace people with machines, with capital goods, with robots. And so that creates a market for a lot of the innovation that's kind of happening higher up the value chain in other parts of China. And at the same time, it kind of, it allows for that, the low-end products to remain in China, to generate wealth, to, it creates greater scope for innovation and whatnot. And so that is Xi Jinping's model of growth, right? It wants productivity gains through innovation and through keeping low-end manufacturing. And I think that's what we see, going back to your question, why, if there's so, in some ways the Chinese economy feels so weak inside of China, why does it look so strong from the outside? It's because of this focus on industrial upgrading, because we're seeing innovative new products come out of China, and because we are seeing, the cost of low stuff remain low, or so low-end manufacturing to remain low, and in some ways the quality to improve. And so we're in a world where kind of China dominates the whole breadth of manufacturing and industrial goods. So many of them turn up. Yeah, increasingly, so many of them are consumer goods as well. But whereas once we sort of associated China with low-end consumer goods, cheap plastic things, and then we associated it with clothing. Increasingly, we associating it with robot vacuum cleaners and vehicles and drones, and in the near future with flying cars. And so, I think the consumer concept of what China produces is very, very rapidly changing. And then beyond that, for anybody who's actually making something in the developed world, China dominates global supply chains. The components that go into manufacturing almost anything, China is almost is sort of the irreplaceable link in the supply chain for almost everything at this point in time. And so when we are looking at the outside looking in, we see this Chinese dominance, not just because it is in everything, it's in all supply chains, but the quality of what it produces is not only good, but rising quickly. And the innovation that's coming out at the same time is beyond anything that we certainly anticipated from China, even 5, 6, 7 years ago. So I think that's kind of where this sort of mismatch in perception, because industrially, China has become incredibly dominant globally over the last 5 years.
Wow. So, Denny, we have these two mismatched stories. We have internally a doubt about China and the future of China and the future for individuals who are in China, saying, I don't know if I'm going to get my Social Security. I don't know if I'm going to be able to afford paying for my parents' medical bills, that kind of thing. Externally, we see this incredible industrial machine that is, as you said, in supply chains everywhere. For people who are looking at China from the outside and want to understand how to deal with China in the future, what do you think they should believe? Because there's still this idea. Mark Carney gave this speech at Davos about the change in the world order. There's always this idea that China is next. So how do we approach that given these two different stories?
Yeah, I think that's something we're all still trying to work out, right? Because on one level, this dominance, this industrial dominance, should translate into a far more robust domestic Chinese economy, right? Because it should mean better paying jobs. It should mean more profitable firms. It should mean an expanding tax base for the Chinese state so they can spend more on pensions and welfare and whatnot. But the thing is, it doesn't mean any of those things at the moment, which is kind of mind-blowing. You look last year, industrial profits barely grew at all. Tax revenue generated by the state barely grew at all. I think it rose, less than 1%. And then, it's harder to track what's happening with wages. Disposable income grew 4% last year, which is, it's been on a steady decline since prior to the pandemic. It's just sort of slowing year on year. But the lived experience of ordinary people can't really be summed up by sort of one data point, one percentage point. I mean, when you're in China, people are genuinely uncertain about their own job security. As I said before, a lot of people working for local governments or local state firms have seen their wages cut over the last few years. People, I think, working for a lot of industrial firms feel a little bit uncertain even about their own job security in the future. And I think the reason for this is China has been able to achieve such industrial dominance, but in many cases, those industrially dominant firms are barely generating any profits at all. And if they're not generating profits, they're not generating taxes. And at the same time, ordinary people aren't really benefiting as much because bonuses aren't materializing and they can't be sure of getting a pay rise next year or the year after. And the reason that this is the case is because China's achieved this dominance through industrial overcapacity. And that's kind of turned up very clearly domestically in China through deflation. Now, China hasn't officially had consumer price deflation. I mean, CPI, Consumer Price Index, has always more or less been positive for the last 3 years. But we've consistently had 3 years every month of producer price deflation. So that's factory gate deflation. The price that factories sell their components and their goods to each other. That's been declining for the last 3 years. And the reason it's been declining is in large part because of industrial overcapacity. Another thing that's worth pointing out, last year, we've got these incredibly dynamic Chinese auto companies, electric vehicle companies, world leaders in EV technology, in plug-in hybrids, with incredible design, right? And yet the entire Chinese auto sector generated less profit last year than Toyota did alone. So that kind of gives you a sense that the margins, the profit margins being generated by Chinese firms are wafer thin. And so all the economic benefits that you usually associate with the sort of export growth and industrial dominance that we see with China, China hasn't been experiencing it because these profits have been wafer thin because of industrial overcapacity, because Chinese industries are producing far more than what is actually needed. And I think this, as much as anything, is the challenge that the rest of the world is facing. I don't think it's felt quite as acutely as in the US as it is in Europe, but Europe is staring down the barrel of what's being called the China Shock 2.0. German firms in particular are all of a sudden sort of discovering, are facing three major crises, really, because China has been an incredibly important source of demand for German industrial goods and manufactures over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And a lot of those goods are, as I said, industrial goods. They go into Chinese factories. But now we're in a situation where the quality of what Chinese firms are making, that firstly, Chinese firms are increasingly able to make almost anything that the German industrial sector can make. And even if the quality isn't quite as good as the Germans, it is close enough and much, much cheaper. And so what that means for the Germans is three things. And you can kind of extrapolate these three lessons to pretty much any developed country in the world, but it's the Germans that are experiencing it most viscerally at the moment. Firstly, the Chinese don't need to import as much from Germany as before. And you're seeing this particularly with the auto sector. I mean, China's done this incredible pivot towards EVs. So I think about any given month these days, about half of all new cars sold in China are electric vehicles. And so there is yet less demand for any vehicle that isn't an EV. And so the Germans are sort of struggling to sell to the Chinese to the degree that they once did. So firstly, there isn't as much demand domestically for German products. The second thing is Chinese exports are now competing inside Germany and in Europe specifically. And so whereas once, in certain industries, no one could compete with the Germans on quality and price, now China is shipping to Europe and shipping to Germany and offering almost as good products significantly less. And so the German firms are finding that even in their home market, demand is being eroded. And then the third challenge is the rest of the world. Right, in third-party markets that they don't have brand loyalty. It doesn't really matter if they buy an imported industrial good from China or Germany. What they're looking for is quality and reliability and price. And so I think you're seeing this most clearly, perhaps, with the Japanese car sector in Southeast Asia. I mean, Toyota, Honda, Nissan, Suzuki, the Japanese truck makers, motorcycle makers. I mean, they've had Southeast Asian auto market on lockdown for like 20, 30 years. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, over the last few years, we've seen sales just everywhere declining aggressively. And so in places like Indonesia and Thailand, in any given year, you might see Honda's sales drop by 12, 15%, which is the sort of stuff you might see in a recession. But these economies are growing incredibly strongly. And what's happening is it's Chinese firms, not just the EVs, but even traditional internal combustion engine vehicles, cheap, well made, well designed, and they're eating the market share of Japanese firms in the rest of the world. And so that kind of comes back to this question. I mean, what is the challenge for the rest of the world? How should we look at this? And I know that the Europeans often talk about this in terms of overcapacity. The problem here is the Chinese are producing far more than the domestic market actually requires, and it's sort of ending up on the rest of the world at prices that are far below what they should be. I think the funny thing is the Chinese don't believe in overcapacity. Now it's funny because a few years ago they used to talk all the time. Every now and then they'd be like, "Oh, we're having overcapacity problems. We're going to deal with it." And you spend a few years dealing with the overcapacity, and then they wouldn't talk about it for a while, and then it'd come back again. These days they don't talk about overcapacity. They talk about this concept of involution, which is a really strange word. I mean, we don't use it that much in English, but the important thing is the reason that they use this word involution rather than overcapacity. And I think outside of China, people have kind of taken the words to mean the same thing. Oh, when the Chinese are talking about involution or anti-involution efforts, they're talking about dealing with overcapacity. And they're kind of right on one level, but it's not quite the same. The Chinese believe that in an open, free market global economy, overcapacity cannot exist because prices will adjust to reflect the demand and supply. So if there is overcapacity, then prices will just come down, and that's a market adjusting. That's part of how they see things. But the other way they see things is that we shouldn't, for so many of the products for which China is accused of having overcapacity, things like wind turbines, solar components to build solar farms, electric vehicles, all this sort of stuff. The way the Chinese see it is that, look, we cannot talk about supply and demand in the context of what is demand for these products at this particular moment in time. Because these sorts of products have almost unlimited future demand. So if we're merely looking today at how much demand there is for wind turbines globally in April 2026, then we're doing ourselves a disservice, because the direction of travel in terms of the world's green transition and the world's demand for sustainable and controllable local sources of energy mean that demand for wind turbines is just going to grow. This year, it's going to get bigger next year and next year. And so when we're looking at China's industrial capacity to be able to build wind turbines, for example, we shouldn't be saying, well, we can build far more, China can build far more than what the world wants to buy today. But that shouldn't be the key metric. What we should be thinking is, what is demand going to be in the future? And that's what China is preparing for. It is putting itself in a position to meet the future demand of key products that are going to be essential to the future economy. And so this is why they talk about involution, because the key idea of involution isn't, when foreigners, in particular Europeans, talk about overcapacity, what they want is China to be able to shut down some of their factories so that there's more of a balance between what China's producing, what they're producing, and that there isn't sort of an erosion of the European industrial base. When the Chinese talk about involution, the key here isn't about supply and shutting down supply. The key here is ensuring that China can enjoy the benefits of this industrial build-out, and they're not at them, and these benefits being what I was talking about before. It's profits, taxes, well-paying jobs, and they're not doing that at the moment because Chinese firms are competing too fiercely with each other, that they're eating into each other's profitability. It's a race to the bottom as they're trying to secure as much market share as possible. And what that means is that you end up in a situation where you have these incredibly successful, well-designed, innovative Chinese companies, but China isn't enjoying the benefits of it. So the point of involution is to go to Chinese firms and say, we don't want these price wars. We want you to, set prices rationally. We don't want to sort of keep zombie firms alive because that's going to drive prices down more. But that is sort of the rationale of anti-involution, efforts. And so, coming back to your original question, how should the rest of the world kind of look at this conflict between what's happening inside and happening outside? Is China is very much committed to both driving manufacturing innovation and industrial upgrading. It sees both its economic security and its physical security, its economic prospects tied up very much with this, indispensable role that it's established for itself in global supply chains. And it actually wants a world in which the rest of the world buy more and more stuff from China. But it's also mindful that it's not fully enjoying the benefits of that at the moment. And so we're in this very strange world where China is just selling more and more stuff. And it's undermining the industrial base of Europe and other developed countries. And at the same time, China is importing back in return relatively little, in part because the Chinese consumers aren't really in a position at the moment to ramp up their spending. And so for the time being, we're in this world which China will continue to export more and more because it has all this capacity. And it can't afford not to. And sort of baked into its growth model is sort of further expanding into creating more innovative products. But for the time being, the rest of the world isn't sort of benefiting from China buying stuff in return.
Dinny, I do want to get into that innovation, AI, robotics. But first, I'm just surprised at how much I've heard you mention Chinese auto manufacturers. It was very easy to list off a bunch from Japan. Just so people know, who would be those auto manufacturers that are intertwined with China?
The biggest Chinese car makers.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing to keep in mind is that you kind of have two cohorts of car manufacturers in China. You have your traditional internal carbon engine manufacturers, a lot of which sort of traditionally set up joint ventures with Western car maker or foreign car makers. So you have big state-owned firms like Dongfeng, which has joint ventures with Nissan. And then, but you do have sort of local Chinese firms as well, like Chery and Geely. And then on the other side, you have the electric vehicles. And the biggest player in the game is BYD. And then you also have Geely is doing a bunch of electric vehicles as well. At the high end, you have XPeng, Zeekr, which is, I believe, a Geely brand. So these are sort of the names that sort of jump out the most at me. But at the moment, the behemoth is BYD.
Okay. So electric vehicles, cutting edge, AI, robotics, cutting edge. And it seems that with the productivity branching that you've talked about, the innovation and the upgrading, that the innovation could be things like artificial intelligence and robotics. And at the same time, that is connected to that upgrading of making the cheaper products, sneakers, toys like that. How important is AI and robotics in China? Where do you think it's going?
So this is where I lean heavily on the work of my colleagues, because this is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. But this is so in my colleague Kendra Schaffer, who's done some fantastic work on this. But pretty much the way that she sees things is that China's pursuit of AI, or the way that it's using AI, is a little bit different from the approach of the United States. Whereas in the US, there seems to be a headlong drive to kind of come up with, generative AI. That's kind of the end goal. That's what everyone's sort of trying to get to first. In China, the focus is very much on trying to deploy AI quickly and effectively in industrial processes. And so the Chinese government has already come up with a bunch of different plans which is along the lines of things like, and they're called things like AI plus transport, AI plus manufacturing, AI plus, I think I'm going to health, aviation. I forget the other ones, but there's almost a dozen of these. And the idea is, how do we deploy AI in the real world now? So AI doesn't have to be perfect. It's not aiming for that same endpoint as the US AI companies are. It's more about, how do we extract as much efficiency and those productivity gains I was talking about as quickly as possible by using AI in the factory floor, or by using it in transport, or by using it in energy. I should have mentioned that one. That's a huge one. I mean, you look at some of the biggest challenges facing China at the moment. It's got this huge installed renewable energy capacity, wind, solar. But of course, the problem with wind and solar is that it's generating energy at a time when no one, needs it. And so you've kind of got an electricity grid which is still, it's not quite antiquated, but it's not up to the task of being able to manage all this renewable energy. And so there's a lot of optimism about bringing AI into the mix. Okay, once we have AI and we inject it into the grid, is this going to be allow us to be able to better manage and direct the renewable energy, get it where it's needed, at various times? And then we've got if we then build out batteries as well, what will then this mean for our ability to better utilize renewables and sort of meet all our energy needs and whatnot? So that, I think, is fairly representative of how they want to use it. They see AI as potentially being able to deliver solutions to certain industrial bottlenecks. And they also see it as a way to be able to maintain their industrial and manufacturing dominance. Now, one of the reasons China has been so successful as a manufacturer and an industrial nation over how long, partly it's subsidies. And those subsidies take different forms. It's cheap land, it's cheap labor, for artificially, keeping wages down through various ways. It's because of, cheap electricity in a lot of places because of renewables. And I think there's a sense of, okay, can we use AI as kind of the next generation advantage that we inject into the manufacturing industrial process now that will give us some sort of cost advantage or quality advantage that will allow us to maintain our industrial and manufacturing dominance for however long. So I think that is kind of the mentality at the moment, sort of the difference in approach. Now, the other big difference is kind of, how you train models and how you kind of develop the AI industries. And this is where you kind of get into geopolitics as well, because it's NVIDIA that's producing the world's cutting edge chips. I forget which US government official which was like, yeah, we should sell the Chinese as many of these as possible so that we can get them hooked. And the Chinese certainly took note and were like, okay, well, maybe we don't want to import those chips at all. And so China's been in this position where I forget where we stand at the moment. I think there's been limited imports of NVIDIA H200 chips. I forget exactly, but certainly China is prioritizing the development of its own domestic chip industry. And I think there's a sense of, look, if we can limit the import of NVIDIA chips, that will sort of help us supercharge the development of our own industry, kind of give us an incentive to get up to speed, or get up to the standard necessarily as quickly as possible. But the other thing that China has been forced to do, and I think this is the example with DeepSeek, is because they don't have access to US cutting edge chips in sort of the scale or the volume that they need or require. Is that they've had to get a bit creative. And so, I think DeepSeek was renowned for using NVIDIA chips more efficiently than their counterparts in the United States. Or in other cases, Chinese AI firms using Chinese chips or using lower quality chips in higher numbers, but taking advantage of China's cheap energy to be able to run far more to kind of try and make up for the shortfall or the gap in quality or the gap in compute power. So that's kind of another thing, another difference between the US and China. But as I said to start with, this isn't, the technical side of things is less my is less my territory, and the more I get into it, the more I'm likely to say something that's a little bit off.
Well, I think you've revealed that we actually maybe have different goals than the way that it's presented here in most stories, which is that the presentation normally is that the US and China are in a race and that we are aimed at the same goal and we both want to be first to artificial general intelligence, which is going to be this sort of godlike AI that's going to cure cancer and fix everything else. But what I'm hearing from you is that actually China is much more oriented toward practical applications in the near future, whereas we are running in that direction. So how does that work if, with our incentives financially too, these U.S. firms are so heavily capitalized, the ones that are pursuing artificial general intelligence, that I understand that they basically, to be effective financially, they're going to have to just eat up every industry with AI. Whereas with China, it seems they could be more measured. I assume the financial incentives are different. How do you see that race dynamic versus a different approach?
No, I think you summed it up really well. I think that we have an inclination to see everything with China these days as a competition. And even though competition does exist, it's not necessarily, the race doesn't necessarily have the same endpoint. And so, also, I think when it comes to China as well, I think the Chinese Communist Party would be far more reluctant to pursue that sort of headlong drive by private institutions to come up with the God AI. I mean, I don't think the Communist Party's always had a few reservations about God to start with, let alone having an AI model that it doesn't have complete control over and has capacities and capabilities that the party isn't fully comfortable with before launch. And so I think, to think that the US and China are heading for the same endpoint, I don't think the CCP would necessarily be comfortable with what, Anthropic and all the other US companies are sort of aiming for. And so this approach of looking for practical applications is far more in line with the CCP's approach to the economy, and really to new technologies. It's really very much grounded in practical applications as opposed to, let's throw it against the wall and see what we can come up with.
So then, if the CCP is probably threatened by the idea of a godlike AI, and yet in the U.S. we seem to be pursuing that headlong, how do you think that they would perceive our AI efforts? Are we a threat?
This is. I think when it certainly comes to military applications and whatnot, Beijing is certainly, concerned and wary and has one eye on it. But this is where we start to stray into territory that's a little bit, past my my ability to speak intelligently on. Yeah, it's a little bit beyond my domain.
Okay, yeah, I find the whole thing surprising because I just hear such a strong story all the time that we are in this AI race, and that although there are lots of reasons for American firms to slow down, that China will just keep going, so somebody has to do it. So we just have to go and try to win the race and hope that we're successful and that we can control this AI. But if what I'm gathering from you is adding up, it really seems that the race dynamic just isn't there. And that's just so surprising.
Yeah, absolutely. It's China's taking a very different approach, and partly because I think it's sort of rooted in China's approach to technology, but I think it's also another element of that is a sense that, I mean, at the moment Chinese AI companies they're lagging the United States, and with the whole all these questions over chips, having access to US chips, if they'll be cut off. Should China cut off access itself? Should it be doubling down on its development of its own industry so that it can develop, its own chips for this, even if they're a little bit subpar? The whole technical equation at the moment in terms of developing AI, it means China isn't quite on a par with the United United States. And so it's the ability of Chinese firms to sort of compete head to head with US firms at the moment, they're not there. And of course, there's a sense of, well, how long is it going to take for them to catch up? I mean, how long is a piece of string? Maybe they will get there, but at the moment, it seems that the sort of institution, at the pace that this is developing, the institutional barriers are probably such that, the Chinese firms aren't really in a meaningful position to quite catch up with the US.
And Denny, what makes you say that China is behind the US in AI? When we see, as you mentioned earlier, dancing humanoid robots in China, it's easy to think that we're actually behind.
Yeah, look, my understanding is that in terms of some of the the metrics and benchmarks, the Chinese firms are certainly up there, but in their compute power to be able to, I mean, this is, as I said, this is where this isn't my own work.
Sure.
This is sort of drawing on other people's, that in terms of compute power and the sort of the revenue Chinese firms are generating, they're just not quite there yet with with their American counterparts. Look, I might turn out to be completely wrong, but I think at the moment it looks like they're kind of one step behind, and given the whole sort of chip wars at the moment, it's that does seem to be at least a institutional barrier for the time being that sort of will make it difficult for them to sort of move at the same pace as the American firms.
I see. I heard you say a few months ago that AI and defense spending are maybe the major forces in China's economy. How do you see defense spending in China? How important is that?
Defense is a weird one in China because we never really get a full sense of how much they're spending. I think every year China's parliament sits for a couple of weeks each year in March. They make an announcement then how much they're spending on military. I think it's usually about, the amount of spending usually goes up about 7% each year. But then there's questions about how much is actually included in the defense budget, what is, what isn't, what's off budget. I mean, we really don't have much sense at all what China is spending on the military. So it's difficult to tell to what extent China's, how big a part of of China's economy the military is these days. I think the more interesting question is sort of dual use, and I think that's kind of what the Chinese authorities are more interested in. I think, one of the reasons that they are so enthusiastic about innovation is because even if innovation is oriented towards consumers or industrial purposes, it often opens up potential avenues to sort of help with defense and and the military as well. But yeah, to be honest, I mean, ultimately, when it comes to military and the economy, the amount of transparency is pretty thin.
How do they keep that veiled? I'm so used to the American system where we know the defense budget and it's quite transparent.
I really don't know. This is it's a little bit outside of my outside of my realm, so
Okay.
I don't have a good sense about military spending.
And you said dual use, so that's
Dual use, yeah,
energy.
it's technology that has both military and civilian applications.
Oh, dual use. I see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's an accent thing. Sorry.
No sweat. No sweat. With defense, have you noticed anything regarding China since the start of the war in Iran?
In terms of the defense realm or economics, because
defense and economics as they play together.
Okay, no. In terms of defense, I mean, it's not an area that I look at. In terms of the economy, I mean, how China is dealing with it. I mean, I think the clearest thing that we have seen, because the whole world, the consequences of the conflict in Iran are being felt everywhere, and it all comes down to supply chains. It's access to energy, it's access to certain raw materials, and I think, if anything, the thing that's come out clearest from how China has dealt with that is that China puts China first. And so, China is a huge exporter of things like aviation fuel. A lot of petroleum, a lot of oil gets exported to China from all around the world, and then China refines it and then sends it onwards. And I think in March, China stopped exporting petroleum products, which has been a huge problem for a bunch of countries, including Australia, including Thailand, which has traditionally been very dependent on exports of petroleum products, diesel and aviation fuel from China. The other thing was fertilizer. Now, I'm going to get the specific details a little bit muddled, but I think China stopped exports of fertilizer and stopped exports of certain components, certain inputs that go into making certain types of fertilizer. And again, this is what China is prioritizing. In moments of tightened global supply, China puts China first. It ensures that not just that Chinese firms and farmers and whatnot have adequate supply, but it has that supply at a reasonable price. And they do that by putting up the walls and making sure that, China is taken care of first. I think that's been quite interesting and kind of speaks to sort of the way that the global economy is shifting. You take a place like the United States, which is, it's not dependent on the rest of the world for oil. China, US, is the world's biggest oil producer, and yet when you have a conflict in a place like Iran, it affects how much we're paying when we go to fill up our cars, right? Despite the fact that if the US did put up the walls, it would have a sufficiently large supply of domestic oil such that it could, keep oil prices down if that was kind of the model that the authorities wanted to pursue. But that's not how the US works. It's set up a free global market where fluctuations or distortions to the price on the other side of the world affect prices in the US, regardless of how much is actually produced in the US. But China tries to limit the impact of global price distortions inside of China. And it does that by, stopping exports of certain products, and then also imposing price controls, which it's done with the price of gas, of petroleum sold domestically in China. It's put a cap on how much diesel and other gas products can be sold, and sort of has forced the cost of that onto China's big oil companies, which will help out in some form or other. But I think that's kind of been the most interesting sort of the economic developments in China.
Dinny, you expose so many interesting sort of paradoxical things about China when it comes to economics and how, on the one hand, it's this huge exporter, and yet on the other hand, China puts China first. We talked a few years ago about the effort to globalize the renminbi. How do you think that has played out?
This is it's a slow moving train, but it's interesting because the way the Chinese authorities talk about it at the moment, they think that they are in a unique moment to pursue renminbi internationalization. Now, this is something that they started to move towards in 2009, so it's not new. But they've made over the first 10 years of that, first 10 years or so, they made fairly limited progress. But China's officials now think that they're in this really unique moment in which they can kind of start pushing renminbi internationalization forward. And I think because they see a fundamental shift. When they first started trying to promote the international use of China's currency, the problem was no one really wanted it. No one really needed it, right? Everyone was happy using the dollar or the euro to a certain extent. And so every gain in terms of renminbi use, kind of required concessions and reforms, and China kind of had to claw incrementally, inch by inch, any sort of, they had to fight for any incremental increase in the renminbi's global acceptance. And those gains were fairly limited. Now they feel the tables have been turned, or the coin has been flipped, that they don't have to fight for those gains anymore, because we're now in a world where firms, individuals, financial institutions are increasingly open to looking for alternatives to the dollar. They don't necessarily want to dump the dollar immediately. They don't want to necessarily stop using the dollar, but they're looking to hedge, and they're looking for alternatives, and they're open to using other currencies. And so Chinese officials are like, oh, for the first time ever, we don't necessarily have to fight inch by inch for the renminbi to be, to be accepted, because all of a sudden the rest of the world is far more open to considering the use of the renminbi in ways that we've never experienced before. Now, at the same time, that just doesn't mean that they're like, okay, well, we're just going to sit back and let the world come to us. There's a recognition that the circumstances have changed, and this now means that any concessions or opening that we make now are likely to be more successful than they were in the past. And so often when people talk about the renminbi internationalization and what China needs to do, it all comes back to this idea of like, well, it means nothing unless they open the capital account, which means that, the renminbi should be allowed to flow freely into China and flow freely out. That anybody outside of China should be able to invest in China's stock market, or I should be able to take my money out of China's stock market and bring it home whenever I want, or the same with bonds or property or whatever. The reality is that's never going to happen. That the way China has sort of developed its capital account opening is the best way to think of it is, rather than open doors, it's set up a whole lot of different tunnels. So there's tunnels from Hong Kong into the Chinese stock market. There's another tunnel from, and there's a tunnel from, I think, Singapore, and a tunnel from London. There's a tunnel from Hong Kong into the bond market. There's a tunnel from Hong Kong into the interest rate swap market. And those tunnels can get bigger and they can be closed off. But for the most part, those tunnels allow a free flow of money in and out of that particular destination with very few limits. But because they're a tunnel, the PBO, the Chinese authorities can always shut it down quickly if they so determine. That is the mode of travel. And so what we're seeing at the moment is, and what we're never going to see, is that big bang reform where one morning we wake up and we're like, there are no capital controls and Beijing is going to now make the renminbi an international currency. That's not what's going to happen. What we're seeing is a whole lot of incremental changes where China's alternative to SWIFT, the international payment system, gets a little bit bigger, gets a little bit easier to use, has more members, or you have more. The PBOC enters into China Central Bank into more swap agreements or larger swap agreements with other countries, so that other countries have a greater supply of renminbi. Or what we saw recently, for the past 6 months. China has been negotiating with BHP, this big Anglo-Australian iron ore miner, over how to price long-term contracts for iron ore. And effectively, as part of that, there's been China's imposed a quasi-embargo on certain types of iron ore being shipped from Australia to China. And that ended last week because the two sides came to an agreement. And part of that agreement is the way iron ore is priced has changed such that about half of the components that go into that price are using Chinese iron ore pricing indexes. So it's like, what is the price of iron ore in renminbi that the steel mines are paying at this port and at this port? And that's important because the whole idea of pricing a commodity in renminbi as opposed to dollars is sort of a preliminary step towards people actually using renminbi to purchase that particular commodity. So the first step is, first you price it in renminbi, then you pay for it in renminbi. And so that's something that China's been moving towards before. So it's stuff like that we're seeing everywhere. A little bit of, more loans denominated in renminbi here, more trade financing in renminbi here. I think at the moment the renminbi is the world's second biggest or third biggest currency for trade financing because interest rates are so low. So you see all these incremental changes and tweaks to the system. Sometimes it's regulatory changes. Sometimes it's political and fairly, the Beijing brings its muscle to bear like it did with its negotiation on BHP. But you've got all these small changes all moving at once, which are all in aid of trying to find ways to advance the ease of use of the renminbi globally and the rest of the world's willingness to use the renminbi. And I think often when people particularly in the US, kind of look at renminbi internationalization, we're kind of like, well, the renminbi is never going to be a currency like the dollar. I mean, that no one's going to be willing. No one is willingly going to use the renminbi to take over the sort of transactions that US financial institutions or hedge funds or the financial sector does globally, transacts in the US dollar. And the thing is, Beijing doesn't want that. Beijing doesn't want its currency to be responsible for trillions of dollars worth of financial transactions daily or annually, or in the currency markets, in swaps, in whatever. It doesn't. It's not interested in the renminbi becoming the global currency. What it wants is to be able to have a degree of economic security by being able to know that its firms can transact in renminbi whenever they want to. So that if the US tomorrow turned around and did to China what it did to the Russians and effectively said, you can't use the dollar anymore, and then the Europeans fall in line and say, you can't use the euro anymore, that ultimately the Chinese can say it doesn't matter because they will be able to pay in renminbi for all the oil they need, for all the iron ore they need, and at the same time, when they sell cars and industrial components and widgets, that they can then accept renminbi in exchange. That's ultimately what they want. They want to be able to build up a system where they can use their own currency to do the things that they want. They don't want to build up a currency where foreigners can do whatever they want in currency, in renminbi, like we have that's pretty much sums up the situation with the dollar. They want a situation where renminbi is globally acceptable sufficiently that in a time of crisis, the renminbi can serve the needs of the Chinese economy. That's ultimately what they want out of this.
Wow. So, Dinny, again, I think you're pointing out a case where we might have a race dynamic story. People would say, well, the U.S., the dollar could lose its reserve currency status. Maybe the renminbi could overtake it. But in fact, what you see is that China has different goals. And it's not about beating the U.S. It's about meeting their own goals. In this case, a sort of financial independence from the U.S.
Yeah, I think that sums it up quite well. It is, and I think there's another layer of goals beyond that. I mean, I think ultimately China wants to be able to use the renminbi more for, making loans overseas, investing its own currency overseas, kind of, ultimately in the long term, we'd see more of it being able to use its own currency to build a sphere of influence or bring other countries more closely into its own economic orbit. But I think the starting point, to the degree that renminbi internationalization has a degree of urgency, it is about providing a degree of economic independence from the US, particularly given the willingness of the US to weaponize its currency. In fact, to weaponize the economic system that it spent the last 80 years building, weaponizing all of that, to be able to have put in place the mechanisms which allow it a degree of insurance against those sorts of weapons working on China.
Danny, we're talking a lot about the U.S. and China. With the coming summit, what do you see for that as it relates to your topic in economics?
To be honest, Brad, I'm not looking at it that closely. Really? Yeah, it's. I mean,
why is that? That's interesting too.
I think at the moment, I think what we have in some ways a sort of economic detente between China and the US at the moment. I think that kind of sort of found its equilibrium in October last year when Xi and Trump met in Busan. And I think, we kind of got to a situation where the US administration has tried to get sort of the upper hand over China through tools like tariffs, and China was very much ready for it and managed to weaponize its control of rare earths in particular, such that we're now in a position where any move by the US that's perceived as an escalation by China will result in some sort of escalatory response. And so where we are at the moment is kind of an equilibrium that no one really wants to upset. And I think there is a sense, I mean, certainly among I think foreign businesses in China at the moment, that things are quite stable. So I think in terms of the summit, there's always, the US side always kind of looks for some deliverables, whether China will buy more Boeing planes or there'll be something else. But I mean, to a certain extent, that's always showmanship, right? It's like when the two parties come together, what can they kind of show the world that they've achieved? Those sorts of deals may have been important in previous years, but given sort of the underlying tensions of the relationship, given what's the radical changes, the rapid and advanced industrialization going on in China, and given the sort of the bigger points of tension, I don't think we're really looking at significant changes coming out of this summit. I think the best we can hope for is that this sort of the quasi equilibrium we have at the moment just sort of continues.
Dinny, something I seem to keep sort of sensing from you is that while in the US, many of us might have this perception that we're in competition with China on so many fronts, that in China, not only is the mood different about, the rise of China and things like that, but also that maybe are we simply not seen as in that sort of competition from China, or how does China view the US?
No, yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think China definitely sees the US as a challenge. The question, I mean, the competitor question is a difficult one, because, I mean, you look at how the Chinese deal with Europe, and every time Europe tries to do something to defend its economic interests, because as I said, I mean, Europe is genuinely worried about an industrial hollowing out. Whenever Europe tries to do something that might crimp Chinese exports or impose limits to Chinese exports, the Chinese push back hard, like very, very aggressively, and do whatever they can to force the Europeans to back down. And it's big. Why is that the case? I think they regard the Europeans as weaker because they can get away from with it, and they regard Europe as just being less important as an economic player. I think China sees the US as a much bigger challenge, partly because the US is a bigger, more important market. I think partly because the US is still a leader in the key technologies of the age, specifically AI, in a way that Europe isn't. I mean, the EU isn't at the technological forefront of sort of key technologies in a way that the US is. But when it comes to being a competitor, I think the areas of competition, it's a curious question. I mean, because the areas of competition are, I mean, if you kind of look at what China is doing, its economic model and the way its economy looks at the moment is no one can compete with what it does. I mean, there's a researcher called Richard Baldwin who's done some fantastic work on China's production of intermediate goods, and he was sort of components, right, stuff that was used to make other stuff, and he's called China the OPEC of intermediate goods because China is just so indispensable. It makes everything that goes into everything else. You can't have a manufacturing firm in China in the United States that doesn't in some ways rely on imported goods from China. I mean, that might be a little bit hyperbolic, but it's not far off. Anyone who's manufacturing outside of China depends on China to a certain extent for components. So in some ways, China is it's a completely different economy. It's playing a completely different game. And so it's not, I think when we're talking competition, it's not necessarily a broad-based competition. I think it's sort of competition in specific areas. And I think if we are kind of talking about an overarching competition, it's competition for influence globally. It's it's competition over sort of who gets to, what the world looks like, and it's, I think increasingly perhaps it is competition over what the global economy looks like in the future. I think those are the points of competition rather than what the Europeans are currently experiencing, which is specifically competition in individual industries. They're experiencing competition in, industrial equipment. They're experiencing competition in, electric vehicles. Whereas I think in the US, it's a lot more about power. It's about influence. It's about what the world looks like. And I think that kind of shapes the relationship between those three countries, those three sort of powers as well.
Wow. That's a nuanced take. And Dinny McMahon, for people who want to hear more from you with takes like that, before we get to our last question, where should they look for you online?
I actually don't have much of a LinkedIn profile, but I would suggest people kind of check out our work at TriviumChina, which is TriviumChina.com. We put out, we cover what's happening in China's economy incredibly minutely, and we put out a daily vignette on kind of what's caught our attention called One Thing from Beijing. So, if you want to see more of our work, that's a good place to start.
Excellent. We'll put links in the description for everyone to check out. And last of all, Dinny, I know you've written about things coming ahead for 2035, and we're saying that China is playing a different game. What do you see China doing between now and 2035?
I think ultimately we're going to see more of the same, right? So that is the importance and the primacy of innovation and this industrial expansion, right? And that's going to have ramifications for every other developed country in the world. As they face potentially deindustrialization, as the Chinese get better at challenging them at their, producing their own industrial and advanced manufactured goods. But I think the thing to watch for domestically in China is, as I said before, this model isn't generating the benefits that it should. At some point, it has to generate profits, taxes, and higher incomes. And I think that is the thing to watch. Do they manage to kind of control overcapacity or their involution to a degree where prices go up, there's fewer factories so that Chinese firms start generating higher profit margins. There's a big focus these days in Beijing on developing producer services. So they look at companies like NVIDIA and Apple, Apple in particular, which doesn't manufacture anything. I mean, all its manufacturing is outsourced to places like China. And yet Apple hires something like, employs something like 90,000 people in the United States, and they're all in high-paying jobs, but they're all services. It's, software engineers, it is, PhDs, designers, advertising executives and marketers, people managing supply chains, lawyers protecting intellectual property. And I think that's the next step that Beijing envisions, that you have all these highly productive manufacturing companies. Can they then sort of layer on those sort of service sector jobs that can help deal with the big youth unemployment problems that they're dealing with at the moment with university grads? And can they do this to kind of start creating the higher paying jobs that they sort of envision that should be coming out of this sort of, this manufacturing and industrial revolution. So I think that's something to watch for. But the last thing they want is to kind of continue this perpetuation of what is effectively a two-track economy that from the outside looks incredibly robust and is becoming incredibly destructive, distorting of the global, the global economic status quo, and yet domestically China's not, enjoying the benefits of it. That isn't really sustainable. And I think that's the sort of thing they're going to sort of strive to see if they can fix or rebalance in some way.
Well, Dinny McMahon, as I said, these perspectives that you have as someone who goes on the ground, speaks the language, and then brings it all into your years and years of experience. Thank you so much for sharing this and for taking this interview with me. I really appreciate it.
No worries, Brad. It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed it.